Alright guys, turn to page 101. Today we're going to talk about polygons and in particular quadrilaterals. Alright, so a polygon is a closed figure with at least 3 sides. Let's fill in this chart down here. So on the left in that column you're going to see the different types of polygons, the prefix, sides, angles, and then draw an example. So for instance, a triangle, prefix is tri, meaning 3 sides, 3 angles. An example would be like that. By the way, that little symbol right there tells us that's a right triangle, meaning that that angle measures 90 degrees. After triangle, we have a quadrilateral. Your prefix is quad, meaning 4 sides, 4 angles. Here's an example. There. So take a minute, go ahead and try to fill in the rest of this chart. When you finish, check yourself with me. Alright, so check yourself. So after quads, we have pentagons, 5 sides, 5 angles, hexagons, heptagons, octagon, like a stop sign, nonagon, and finally, decagon. It's going to be important that you know these different prefixes and what that means. Alright, so on page 102, let's look at some vocabulary. So perpendicular, that's 2 lines or rays that come together to form 90-degree angles. So if you look at this example here, these 2 lines are coming together, and here we have our right angle. Okay, the next word is bisector. So to bisect means that you cut something in half. So a bisector is to cut a line into 2 equal parts. So for instance, these 2 lines, EA and LN, bisect each other here at point or angle O. Okay, the word congruent, and this symbol right here, the equal with the little squiggly, means congruent. Congruent is how in geometry we say 2 shapes would be equal. So congruent means same shape and size. So for instance, these 2 triangles right here, we'll say they're congruent. Okay, finally, adjacent, that means side by side. So for instance, this segment A and segment C would be adjacent to each other on this pentagon. Alright, down here, this is kind of getting ahead of us, but it says which polygon can be placed in the box with the required characteristic. Diagonals are congruent. So in just a minute, we're going to talk about how a property of a rectangle would be congruent diagonals. So the answer would be A. Okay, so on page 103, we have this flowchart of the different quadrilaterals that you're going to have to know. Let me explain the way this works. So I made this note always over here, always up, sometimes down, never side to side. What that means is, let's say we come over here to a rectangle, and I said, is a rectangle a parallelogram? Because I'm going up from a rectangle to a parallelogram, you would say always. Let's say they said, is a parallelogram a trapezoid? Because they're side by side, you would say never. Or if you're going down the chart, you would say sometimes. So number 1, is a rhombus a square? Rhombus to square is down, so the answer would be sometimes. Is a square a parallelogram? Because you're going up from square to parallelogram, the answer would be always. Is a rectangle a square? Because you're going down, it would be sometimes. 4 says, is a parallelogram a trapezoid? So they're side by side, so never. And finally, number 5, is a rhombus a rectangle? So again, ordinarily, if things are side by side, the answer is never. But because rhombus and rectangle are in the same family, the answer here would actually be sometimes. If that rhombus were a square, then it would be a rectangle. So sometimes. Okay, so page 104. You're going to need this page in a few minutes when you do your Google Slides activity. So for right now, let's go ahead and label what these different quadrilaterals would be. So we have this example here. Let me explain these symbols that they've shown us. So these lines here indicate that these two sides are congruent. Then these two lines here indicate these two lines are congruent. So opposite sides and angles are congruent. We know the angles are congruent because they have these arches in them. These two arches means that these two sides are the same. The one means these two are the same. We also have opposite sides that are parallel. We show that with these little arrows on the side. So this would be a parallelogram. Okay, then we have all congruent sides. I know that because it has that one line, and opposite angles are congruent. So these two angles are congruent, and these two are congruent. Because all sides are congruent, it would either be a square or a rhombus. Because we don't have 4 right angles, we cannot call it a square. So this is a rhombus. It says diagonals are perpendicular bisectors. What that means is, if you drew diagonals through the rhombus, they're going to bisect each other at 90 degrees. Going back to parallelogram, those diagonals would be bisectors also. Okay, then we have a rectangle. We know that because we have 4 right angles, and we cannot call it a square because it doesn't have all equal sides. Diagonals are congruent. Square. So a square also has perpendicular bisectors, like a rhombus. You have 4 congruent sides and 4 right angles, like height. So adjacent sides are congruent, and again, adjacent means side by side. 1 pair of opposite angles are congruent, so these two, and then perpendicular diagonals. Finally, we have a trapezoid. Exactly 1 pair of parallel sides. So again, you show parallel lines with that little arrow. Okay, look at page 106. We'll do a few of these together. So a test-taking strategy for you, I would memorize this chart, and I would draw that on your test. Abbreviate if you need to. So quad, parallelogram, trapezoid. We'll leave kite off. Rectangle, rhombus, and then square. Alright, so we'll look at number 9. A square is a rhombus. So square to rhombus, you're going up, so always, always up. Look at number 11. A parallelogram is a rectangle. So parallelogram to rectangle is down, so the answer would be sometimes. Look at number 15 down below. What shape is a rectangle and a rhombus? So rectangle and a rhombus, that would be a square. Because a square is always, because you're going up, always a rectangle, always a rhombus. Alright, next page. Alright, so on this part of the assignment, you're going to have to name every quadrilateral that describes each figure, then circle the best name. So number 21, for instance. Again, I would make your chart. So quadrilateral, parallelogram, trapezoid, rectangle, rhombus, and square. Alright, so 21, we have opposite sides are congruent. I know that because I just showed that with my lines here. These two are the same, and then these two are the same. We have 4 right angles. So this would be obviously a quadrilateral, a parallelogram, and a rectangle. So rectangle would be the best. We can't call 21 a square because it doesn't have 4 congruent sides. Look at 26. So 26 has all congruent sides. We know that because we have these lines here. But it doesn't have 4 right angles, so we cannot say it's a square. But it will be a rhombus and a parallelogram. Parallelogram and rhombus. And don't forget a rhombus has perpendicular bisectors. On 22, give yourself the 4 right angles and all congruent sides. Look at 29. So we have 4 sides, so obviously it's a quad. But you can't call that anything else. It's not a parallelogram because it doesn't have opposite sides parallel. It's not a trapezoid because it doesn't have just one pair of parallel sides. This shape actually has no parallel lines, so just a quadrilateral.